Alright, guys. I'm getting excited for LOA On. That's going to be broadcast in a few days. They have an announcement about LOA On coming up. And I wanted to make a video just having a little bit of a talk about what kinds of things I'm excited about, things that I think about the game. And I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts about what you think is going to happen at LOA On as well. The biggest thing on my mind, and I think on a lot of people's minds, is how is LOA On going to address a lot of the feelings about the game that the player base has fostered over the last however much period of time that we've been playing it. Now, obviously, as a Western player of the game, LOA On has typically been very Korea focused. But that only makes sense because Korea has been kind of like the major region that the game has been operating in for a super long time. They have the Russia servers, they have the Japan servers and stuff like that. But mostly like Smilegate, they mostly kind of like focus on Korea, and then all the other regions are kind of an offshoot of that. Now there's a lot that I could go into that on my own. I have my personal thoughts about that, but that just seems like how they operate. Korea is kind of like the main region, and then when they make decisions about what happens in Korea, then they start kind of like thinking about how they can distribute that to the other regions. Personally, I would be more excited about the game overall if Smilegate were to look at the game as kind of like a global product. And this is speaking from a lot of bias as a Western player. But what I mean by that is if on the LOA On they actually address things that the Western player base has been feeling, or just things like globally that the player base has been experiencing, because I don't think it's just the Western players that have been thinking about things like the grind or things like the structure of the game and the gatekeeping and stuff like that. I think these things are pervasive in the Korean version of the game too. Them addressing those topics, I think, is going to be kind of like the biggest thing on everybody's mind, kind of like the elephant in the room in some ways. Now, what do I think they'll actually say about it? I'm not sure, but I just hope that they'll talk about it in some way. Personally, I would love for them to actually provide some kind of like a future vision of the game that feels like they're kind of actually addressing the systemic issues of the game in a way that makes me feel excited about the content that's going to be coming out in the future. I kind of think that they're locked into their schedule of release that they have planned. So for what we know of, that's Theamine, and then the last LOA On, they announced that Kazuros is going to be the last Legion raid after that, right? And it seems like narratively, thematically, in the arc, no pun intended, of Lost Ark that we're in, Kazuros seems like the end point of all of that, right? Theamine is the last Legion commander, and then Kazuros feels like narratively he's like the big obstacle that our heroes have to go through before they can kind of even imagine wrapping up this narrative arc. That being said, I also think that that is the most appropriate time after Kazuros for the game to be considering a new overhaul, something like a Tier 4. Now, I know that there has been some discussion about a Tier 4 previously, and for a few reasons, Smilegate has been kind of wishy-washy on what they want their Tier 4 to look like, if they even want a Tier 4. And then there's always those complaints about like, oh, you know, when you went from Tier 1 to Tier 2, and Tier 2 to Tier 3, like all your accessories and stuff basically had to reset. This definitely is something to think about, but from my perspective, Lost Ark is a game that is 5-6 years old now. I think it came out in 2019. That's like 4 or 5 years. It's pretty old, and from an MMO perspective, that's a long time, right? I think even for Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn to Heaven's Ward, I don't think it was even 4 years. It might be pretty close. There was a pretty big gap of time before the Heaven's Ward expansion came out. All that to say, though, I think in practical terms, like, we've been playing this game for a long time. I say we as like the collective global community. Korea specifically has been playing this game for a long time, and I think there are a lot of things about Lost Ark that are very antiquated. They're only starting to add some changes that clean up tier 1, that tier 1 experience and stuff like that. But to be honest, like it's very, there's a lot of things that are antiquated. I can give one example here. A lot of the earlier Guardian raids are really amateur in their design and in their mechanics, right? Compared to the modern Guardian raids that are released, they're days apart. So some things that you could reference are Guardian raids having very little tells before they do moves that are pretty necessary to dodge. They kind of randomly go through different move sets. They have a lot of random like movement around the place. They don't have a lot of recovery on their moves, right? Just all these things in general, especially if you think about some like on the Western release, right? Pre-nerf of these Guardian raids before they actually like look through them and try to make them a little bit more palatable. Like some of those Guardian raids were ridiculous, and some of them I would say are even harder than certain fights that we have in terms of Legion raids, because not in the sense that they were actually like difficult to beat, because obviously the numbers balancing was different, but if you could imagine a similar fight with a similar moveset that is on the same level of gear check and numbers check as some of these Legion raids, I do think they would be harder than some gates. But that was mostly because the design was not very good, and not that the challenge was actually like interesting or engaging or challenging in a good way. So all that to say, I think Lost Ark has, it's kind of like a history lesson, to be honest. If you go through the level 1 to 50 experience and then go from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3, it's like going through a walkthrough history of Lost Ark's development, right? Ideas that they had that were given up. There's a bunch of systems that they kind of like started out with when the game first came out, their original idea for what their MMO was going to be like, that they kind of like abandoned. So I think at some point, what I'm saying is I think they need like some kind of an expansion like release. Like we definitely need a facelift on Lost Ark, right? Especially as it relates to some of these things like the Chaos Dungeon system, the Guardian Raid system, the daily systems. What better a time to revamp this than when you create some kind of an expansion? Let's think about a little bit. When Final Fantasy XIV comes out with their expansion, or when WoW comes out with their expansion, what is the kind of facelift that the players can expect? And I'm talking about this in the best ways possible, right? Let's not talk about the bad releases of expansions, because nobody wants that, nobody cares about that. But when expansions work well, players can get excited about entire new ways to engage with their classes. Players can get excited about new environments, new zones, new monsters, new combat mechanics, right? We can get excited about new bosses, new storyline, new cinematics, better animations, new models, right? We can get excited about new systems, right? New ways to engage with gearing, updates and quality of life changes that make the player experience noticeably better and more fun to progress through the game. These are all things that I think we should expect out of an expansion release. Lost Ark has gone however many years without releasing a single thing like that. Instead, we've gotten like piecemeal good updates. I genuinely believe that a lot of their quality of life updates, and especially recently, to be honest, a lot of the classes that they rework or change significantly how their skills work actually change for the better, right? I think pretty much every single class that has been touched in terms of like reworking their skills and stuff like that has ended up feeling quite a bit better than they were before. However, all these updates come in small, tiny pieces, and we don't ever get like a systems overhaul, and we don't ever really get like a new fresh look at the game from top to down, a re-leveling of the gear level, which is what most people talk about with tier 4 and stuff like that. We don't really get a point where they kind of like take a step back, look at their systems and say, hey, in the modern times for how we're playing Lost Ark now, can we just kind of like wipe the slate mostly clean and then just have the players live in a better environment, right? Play in better systems and play in more updated philosophies for how our game should kind of work from the minute-to-minute experience. That really hasn't happened with Lost Ark. Now, recently, the West got the Elgasia update, And Elgasia was pretty exciting for when it came out in KR, because I really do think many things about the Elgasia update kind of like fall into a new philosophy. I've been really enjoying this first release of Elgasia with Kyngel, because I thought that the story was significantly more interesting than anything that came before. I also thought the experience of playing through the story quest was a lot leaner. It was a lot more efficient, a lot more streamlined, a lot less random, getting sidetracked, doing things that don't feel like they're very cool at all, and very straight to the point. Dialogue and key gameplay moments, and then interesting cinematics, right? And it was very snappy. If you're skipping through the storyline, you can actually get through it pretty fast. If you just want to watch the cinematics and get the large story beats, you can do that too. And then if you want to play and read every single piece of dialogue, you can go through that in that laborious process. But there's a lot of ways to engage with the narrative, and it's actually interesting. Finally, the Kyngel dungeon, I think, also represents a new philosophy with their design. I feel like since the Vicus Legion raid release, Lost Ark raids had been heading in this direction, where they're straying more and more away from playing your class, and they were straying towards handling gimmicks and mechanics that the fight required you to do to pass the game. Now, what this means, I think, if I were to summarize the experience and kind of like the negative aspects of how that experience culminates, what it feels like is it becomes less and less important for you to know your class. If I'm playing Arcana, it doesn't really mean very much that I spent a ton of hours getting really good at the Arcana if, when we do Clown Gate 3, the raid is basically centered around, do you know how to do your Mario transitions? Can you do the platforming appropriately? Can you dodge saws and hooks? Obviously, there's a little bit that has to do with your class, knowing your gap closers, knowing your speeds and what you can get away with. Like, there's a little bit of that that exists, but it's certainly not like, it doesn't matter how many hours of time I put into playing Lost Ark and I put into playing Arcana. When that Clown raid releases and we get to Gate 3 and we have to do the Mario platformer, this doesn't happen in any other point in the game that's relevant, right? Like, where are we supposed to, like, what kind of skill sets are being developed by doing the Mario platforming mechanic? Now, don't get me wrong, sometimes it can be kind of fun to have gimmicks like this that change up the way that you play your game. But the difference is when your experience feels like it's mostly predicated, the success of your Clown raid is mostly predicated on how well you do the Mario transition and then how well you do the platforming, that doesn't feel very good, right? And I feel like Vicus was one step in that direction. If we look at Volton, Volton is a boss fight that has a few mechanics, just a little bit, but mostly it's about the action combat, right? Identifying Volton's movesets, dodging well, DPSing well, and then just avoiding attacks, right? And you're playing your class, you're bringing solutions that each class can bring uniquely. The Reaper can do some interesting things to dodge Volton's moveset while keeping uptime. The Arcana does a few different things. The Destroyer and Gunlancer do different things, right? You're very focused on the action combat, and the mechanics are kind of secondary to that. Now, when Vicus came, we went one step towards the gimmick focused design, right? There were things like the color orbs, right? There's some things like the typing test. There's a lot of breaks in the action, and now you have to do the statues and the swords. Just a lot of examples of these mechanics that are like taking you away from the action gameplay and moving towards gimmicks. Now, you know, when Clown came out, there's a bunch of things that relates to the roulette and kind of like the maze and the platformer game and stuff like that. And thematically, it's actually kind of cool because the Clown Gate obviously is supposed to be kind of like a circus a little bit, right? So thematically, it's fine. Clown was definitely another step towards that gimmick design, the direction that we were heading in since Vicus. Now let's talk about Belshazzar. Okay, I think one of the things that is the most disliked about Belshazzar is that you have lots of mechanics, and I do think that your knowledge of your class is still very relevant because the numbers are tuned so high, especially for hard mode, and if you're doing it on eye level. You obviously need to know how to play your character, but then you also have all these gimmicks, okay? You spend a lot of time waiting around in Gate 5. I mean, Gate 5 literally You can hit that DPS requirement, but you're holding because you just don't want to mess up shapes, right? You're breaking apart the flow of the action gameplay because there's a gimmick that you need to solve. We're going to wait and make sure we don't mess up the shapes, okay? Gate 6 is very similar. We're going to wait and make sure we don't mess up the meteors. There's a lot of let's stop and wait to make sure that we beat the mechanic gimmick part of the fight, as opposed to making the focus of the fight the action combat, and then having the gimmicks be a little bit on the side and something that's important for you to do, but not really the thing that you think is the primary thing that we need to figure out to beat this raid. So that brings us to Kyangel. Kyangle's fight design seems like a step back towards the direction that we were at with Vultan, where a lot of Kyangel, like, there's not a lot of large mechanics. You know, there's a few health bar mechanics here and there, but for the most part, Kyangel is here's a bunch of different normal moves, and you need to figure out how to handle the dangerous moves that this boss is throwing at you. And then there's a few gimmicks here and there that you need to do. I like that a lot better because it feels like my mastery of the game, it's a skill set that I've been developing, right? I've been playing Lost Ark now since the Western release, right? And I've been playing it a lot. I've been playing a lot of Lost Ark. And over the course of time, there's some foundations of Lost Ark combat and action gameplay, and some foundations of playing a class like Arcana that I've been developing over that time. In Kyangel, more so than the raids that came before it, feels like it rewards that earned knowledge a little bit better. Okay, it feels like it rewards that earned knowledge a little bit better. Now, obviously, there's still some mechanics that you have to get used to in Kyangel. In Gate 4, getting used to the shield sucking, and then when you're dodging for the safe spot as well, past 60 bars, right? Like, that can be a little bit awkward to get used to. And for sure, some people will get walled on that, and so they feel like they can handle the rest of the fight, but that's the last thing that they have to solve. But that is a far cry from, okay, we got to get through Mario 1, Mario 2, Mario 3, Mario 4. It's literally like Clown is like, I push it for what feels like a minute maybe, and then I'm like doing this transition, and a minute maybe, and then I'm doing another transition. Now we're doing showtime, and then now we're doing another transition, and now we're doing another transition. It's literally like you spend the entire gate sitting in Mario's, right? And this problem is worsened when your gear gets better, right? As your gear gets better and you do more damage, you're just skipping from mechanic to mechanic, which is another problem entirely on its own that maybe we can talk about in this video, because I hope that's one of the things that LOA ON addresses as well. But you just skip from mechanic to mechanic, and it emphasizes the problem of all this gimmick stuff that's happening in Raid. So to me, how does this relate to LOA ON? Well, I feel like the game is heading in a pretty good direction recently with their narrative stuff, with their raid design stuff. I don't know what Akan is going to be like, but I'm going to be really excited if Akan feels like there's a lot of really fun action combat gameplay there to play. And then the gimmicks are kind of like tastefully sprinkled on top of the fight. Makes you feel very rewarded for playing as a team, and it feels good to like complete those gimmicks. I would be excited if Akan ends up being a raid like that. So with this whole thing with tier 4 or the expansion or whatever that comes, I think in the ideal world, LOA ON is talking about something big like that, because I think otherwise, if you're leaving your player base to kind of continue to live in this environment where we're just going to see more of the same, right? Another Chaos Dungeon releases, it's going to be more of the same. I mean, look at how many pages of Chaos Dungeons we have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 pages of Chaos Dungeons here. And then within those 6 pages, there's so many different levels. Do you guys even know what the difference between each of these Chaos Dungeons are? There's literally no innovation in gameplay for these Chaos Dungeons. Now, here's an olive branch that I'll extend to people who actually like Chaos Dungeons, because I think that it's not that I dislike the gameplay of AoE mob clearing and being really powerful and being able to blow away a bunch of mobs and stuff like that and having select bosses, but none of the systems are designed around that gameplay. It's not fleshed out at all to be a real game. If you're going this ARPG, Path of Exile, Diablo route, those games come with a lot to offer with that package. There's a bunch of gear progression, there's a bunch of character progression that comes with that, being able to explore different builds, make different characters, level them up, right? The rewards that you get for going through the Diablo or PoE experience are way more expanded and way more varied than I get some honor shards, right? Or I get a leap stone, or I get a million accessories that are just always trash because we need every single piece of RNG to work out on the quality, the stat, the engravings, right? The negative engravings. I need all of these to work out perfectly for it to be any use at all in the market, right? There's not like a half good accessory. Basically, by the time they get to Ancients, people aren't going to invest in an ancient accessory that isn't perfect because it's just not worth your money at that point, right? Which means that most ancient accessories are just trash. I'm getting ahead of myself, but basically, like, these chaos dungeons, we've had them for years and they are terrible. They are a terrible gameplay experience and they haven't been updated at all. How is it exciting if they come out with a new patch, if they come out on LOA ON and they say, hey everybody, get excited for the new tier of chaos dungeons. Get excited for what? It's literally the same thing, right? We need a facelift on the game. So that's kind of like some of the directions that I'm thinking about for like what is actually going to be something big that they can announce that will make the player base excited about what's to come for Lost Ark. Legion raids have been a great addition to the game, but I think Legion raids now are being understood as kind of a staple of the game. Because theoretically, if you design them well, they uphold kind of like some of the best aspects of Lost Ark, which is the combat, the action gameplay, the class expression. Some of these things are the best aspects of Lost Ark, but I think they need to update the rest of the game to kind of match that energy. Or they need to update the game to provide different avenues of equal quality as the Legion raids. And even then, the Legion raids have their issues, right? If they continue to announce more Legion raids, we're going to come out with Legion raid number 22 or whatever it is, and you're still going to experience gatekeeping. You're still going to experience like really harsh reward systems with the fact that you have to do them a bunch of times on a bunch of different characters. We're still going to have FOMO systems in there. People are going to not feel very excited about that. This is why I think that the best action for Smilegate to take is to have some big overarching systems rehaul and announce that it feels like it's about time. Anytime today or after today, right? If you don't do it today, tomorrow is the best time. If you don't do it tomorrow, the day after is the best time, right? Any day from this point forward is like a good day for you to talk about a new vision of Lost Ark. We haven't had an expansion for a really long time. It's about time for you to do it. That being said, what is likely to happen? What's probably going to happen when LOA ON comes out, because I really, as much as I think it would be good for them to do, I really doubt that they're going to announce some kind of tier 4 or expansion. It would be really nice, but I'd give it like 10-15% chance that that would be the case. Maybe if I'm feeling really generous, maybe 20% chance, but it's really low. I'm not feeling optimistic that they'll actually do that. Likely what's going to happen is they're going to announce a few more small quality of life things. They're going to announce a few more things that are going to help the new player enter into this infinite, impossible system of vertical progression that they've created for themselves. The vertical of the vertical progression is taller than Mount Everest at this point, right? Like, just because you're adding in a few more sources of cards. I mean, they added in this deep dive card set. It's still like terrible, right? Nobody's actually getting deep dive if they're a new player and they're just starting out the game, right? Like, it's not happening. Deep dive isn't doing anything. What deep dive, the person that deep dive does help is like that intermediate player who doesn't have Light of Salvation 18 or whatever, and they are still engaged in the game and they are doing all the crazy grind stuff because they're going to find the merchants and buying out the cards and stuff like that, right? Like that's who deep dive is helping. The new player, deep dive means nothing at all. They're not getting anything out of deep dive. So likely what I think is going to happen is they're just going to announce a few more like small quality of life things. Maybe they're going to talk about Theamine a little bit more. They're going to talk about Kazaros a little bit more. They're going to talk about the Soul Eater, which is super cool. But I think it's just going to be business as usual. They're going to talk about just some small updates they're going to have. Maybe they're going to talk about like some new systems for cosmetics and stuff like that so that people can have like new things to do with their aesthetics and stuff, which I think is an important addition to the game that they have to consider, right? They've only recently added in kind of like the dash and the walking effects, right? The trails for the characters. They've only recently announced that new cosmetic, but I think they need a lot more. But I think if that were to happen, which is the most likely thing to happen, I think people would be disappointed. So with that, I'd like to know what you guys think. What are you guys most looking forward to with LOA ON? Now, I'm still very excited, right? I still very much like Lost Ark. I love playing it. And I'm really excited for the Soul Eater to come out and read more about it. For the Soul Eater specifically, I wanted it to be a more technical class. And I'm feeling a little bit concerned. Like, on the one hand, I think like that the assassin class overall has some pretty technical characters. Maybe Shadowhunter being the slightly more outlier to this. I don't really know how technical a Shadowhunter is, but my impression is that they aren't a very demanding class at all to play, is my impression. But I think like Deathblades and Reapers, right? Like, they're definitely not like the simplest classes to engage with. So there is that aspect of it that would be good news for if you're looking for Soul Eater to be a more technical class. But the thing that makes me worried is that they just released the Slayer, and I think in their minds the Slayer is a very technical class, especially with Punisher. I think in their minds they see Punisher as like a very technically punishing class. If you're not executing well, you fall behind, which I could kind of agree with, but that also means like, how likely is it that they're going to release 2 classes in a row that are like very technically demanding and may alienate players that are like a little bit more casual? That makes me a little bit worried. So I'd love to see Soul Eater be a more technical class, but we'll see. What do you guys think? Do you guys think they'll talk about Tier 4 in any way, shape, or form, or an expansion? I do think that at some point you need to chop down the vertical progression tree, right? It's so tall at this point that almost any kind of like new player, like we're gonna help you get back into the system, is not gonna work unless you functionally chop out a portion of the game anyways, right? On top of that, I think like, if they don't announce these things, then that means we're stuck in this system, right? With lockouts, with weekly gold resets, with the weekly raid system that's currently like, I just don't really want to see Lost Ark be stuck in this system cycle for another year, 2 years, year and a half, right? I want them to say something that's going to be exciting for us to hear, and that's gonna make us feel like we're getting a refresh of the experience, a rehash, kind of like a rethinking based on what they know now about how their player base likes to enjoy the game. Here's one thing that I will say. I think I mentioned this the last time LOA ON Winter came around, but one of the most disappointing things for me to hear was when they displayed that question that a viewer asked about what they were going to do with the daily time investment. And the way that they answered that question on stream was incredibly disappointing. And it's the thing that makes me the least positive about the direction that the game is heading in. The person said something to the effect of, this is the minimum amount of time that we think is viable for somebody to play the game and feel like they're actually having like a good amount of investment in it. Something like that. They said this is the amount of time that we decided that players should play the game. And I really did like that, because that presupposes, first of all, you have to know that us as players, we don't know what the solutions are, right? And we often don't really know what we want, but we know what we don't like. We really know what we don't like. And so when somebody asks a question, can you reduce the amount of daily investment that we have? You as a designer should be thinking, what are they really asking? The question is not about how much time can I as a player play minimum, right? If I enjoy your game, I'm not asking the question like, what's the least amount of time I can get away with playing your game? No, if I actually enjoy playing your game, I want to play your game all the time, right? The problem that this player is actually experiencing is, in the time that they are investing in the game, they aren't feeling rewarded, they aren't having fun. This is the question, right? It's not a question of like, well, this is the amount of time that we've allotted. That has nothing to do with what is actually going to solve the problem. And as a designer, if you're giving the answer, if you're answering that player's question directly in that way, it makes me feel like you don't really get what's going on, right? It makes me feel like you don't really understand that the complaint is more about the experience of playing in those 15 minutes, in those 20 minutes, in those 30 minutes, or having to do those dailies. It's more about the experience of having to do that than the amount of time. If this LOA ON happens and we get more of that, then I'd get more and more concerned. But we'll have to see. I'm super excited for the LOA ON, and I'm eager to hear what you guys would like to hear about. And hopefully you guys are excited as well. I can't wait, and looking forward to reading about your guys' experiences.